Thank you for joining us for another episode of Channel Revelations. I'm Ethan Fox, and I'm here with Micheila Sheldan. And we'll be spending the next couple of hours talking about some interesting topics, like ancient civilizations and some of the teachings from ancient times as they pertain to today. Before we start, I want to mention that if you are seeing advertisements on this video, if you're watching it as a video on YouTube, they have started putting ads on our videos, even though we have advertisements turned off. So you can, it does tend to sort of ruin the integrity of the content we put here. So you can watch or listen to us on Rumble. Just search AAE on Rumble, or Awaken Empowered Podcast on iTunes or Spotify or any number of other podcast platforms as well. So there are lots of other places you can watch or listen ad-free. So you may want to check that out. So we're ready whenever you are ready to get started. And as I always mention, Micheila is a trance channel, so she is not conscious during these channeling shows. But I don't discuss any of the questions with her beforehand, just so I can make sure that none of the information that we're discussing enters her conscious mind and interferes with the channeling. So we'll get started.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like Thoth ready, and also Metatron, same as last time.
We are pleased to access any being or information necessary to provide information to those who are asking.
And Council of Light is also as usual, or?
Always.
Okay. All right. I want to pick up where we left off last time and continue that conversation a little bit further. At the very end of our show, we discussed how Enki was more malevolent, and Enki was more benevolent, and Enlil was more malevolent. But I want to delve into that idea a little bit deeper and explore it further before we continue. Another thing we discussed was that the Anunnaki and the Atlanteans were both ninth dimensional collectives, but when the Anunnaki came to Earth, which was toward the beginning of Atlantis, they, in that process of coming through the portals to Earth and transitioning to the Earth dimension, they descended from a ninth dimension to a fifth dimension. Is that correct? Am I on the right track?
It is correct, yes.
Okay. And we also discussed how the Atlanteans had a lower amount of density than the Anunnaki. And so as a result, the Atlanteans, in their civilization, they were able to consider, because they were ninth dimensional and also with operating with less density, they were able to consider the needs of others in the civilization, and also even the effect of their actions on the rocks and other mineral or elements that they were working with. So essentially, this higher dimension, less density, allowed them to be more conscious and also compassionate to the needs of others and the planet as a whole. Whereas the Anunnaki, operating from a fifth dimension and a higher amount of density, were not able to do that to that same degree. Am I on the right track?
You are. Of course, we always like to add to what you are saying, because it is not so linear as a relationship to density and dimension. The earth operates in free will choice. So, in terms of a soul coming through a portal and hybridizing into any form, they must adapt and then rationalize their choices to that reality. And considering that the Anunnaki had been through so many different challenges throughout their history, they came with a great deal of wisdom and knowledge and information to teach. However, it may have been their choice at times to hide that information for their benefit only. So these choices have to come into the equation, because as a soul is operating within its divine plan or experience, through every decision that it is making, it does change its relationship to dimension and density.
Okay. So just so I can clarify and understand the concept in a very simple way, so are you saying on an individual basis, even though what I stated earlier may be true, meaning that the Anunnaki, because they were operating from a fifth dimension and a higher level of density, maybe they were not able to consider the impact on others or the whole of the planet, but on an individual basis, each Anunnaki being could choose where they land in that scenario. For example, one Anunnaki being could have less density than another, and therefore they may be operating in a more benevolent way versus another one who may have more density, even though both could be operating in the fifth dimension. Is that what you're saying?
It is true that opportunities for awakening abound throughout the universe in any dimension or density or form that a soul might choose. It is just the occasion of free will choice that is going to tell the tale as to whether or not a soul is going to take the path of that awakening, perhaps, and move out of the density that precludes it from becoming less dense and more available to better options.
Is it fair to say then that that in the fifth dimension, if and of course we are now sort of bridging to the fifth dimension as a collective again, but if in the fifth dimension, the Anunnaki, if one Anunnaki being were to have more density than another, that one that has more density is more likely to be focused on self and ego and not able to see or consider the needs of others or the planet as a whole, for example, with their actions or even their thought process, versus a fifth dimensional Anunnaki who has less density can consider the needs of the whole more so and be less self centered, more benevolent.
We agree with the analogy that you are using here, even though the fifth dimension is an operable bridge or technology into the multidimensional universe or operating in a multidimensional structure. It does not mean that density cannot be created in that reality. And if you are to reflect back to our previous transmission, you will remember that density can be perceived in multiple lights. And this is why there's a great deal of confusion about it on planet Earth today. We've described density as an energetic field that can either complicate or lighten the perspective of any being, regardless of the form that they choose. But oftentimes, what we notice is the density gets carried from the dimension before. Even though a soul can evolve between dimensions, it does not always mean that they're using the expanded consciousness that they are accessing to their benefit or to the benefit of others. And that's why today, on the planet, in the situation you find yourselves in, there has been such a tremendous amount of awakening, but perhaps even more suffering, because those who are awakening are having such a difficult time adjusting to all that they are seeing in the experience they now have. Meaning, there were things hidden before that may have been very convenient to not know that are now available, and creating some distortion in their field. It truly has to do with the dominant emotion, or as we have discussed, the imprint that's being created around any timeline experience. And that imprint can be any degree of density, regardless of the dimension.
Okay. Getting back to what we were discussing before, then, well, first of all, the Anunnaki prior to coming to Earth at that time, the group with Enlil and Enki I'm referring to, they were in the ninth dimension. So prior to coming, so is it reasonable to say that in the ninth dimension they would have, obviously they have a lot of evolution that they had to go through to reach the ninth dimension? But were they would you consider them benevolent when they were in the ninth dimension on Nibiru prior to coming to Earth and entering the fifth dimension, or were they always malevolent?
Well, you have to consider the events of Nibiru at the time in order to get the full picture as to how beings who have ascended into the ninth dimension might come through a portal to another planet and assume a lower one. it has more to do with, we'll say, a chain of events or a series of cataclysmic experiences that were diminishing the connection or the potential in terms of creation within that race. And we can go back and say that this has happened in so many different planets and in different races throughout time. You've even had cataclysms on your own planet. But what happens, regardless of the dimension that you assume, is a being will carry the energy of that cataclysm with them. It tends to focus them in the transcendent form that they were always meant to assume, but in assuming it through another dimension, meaning coming through a portal. And hybridizing into something else. All of those memories, the challenges, even the wisdom that was assumed in the assumed past has to be reconnected, recalibrated, almost like the pieces of a puzzle being put back together. And this is across the board been a very difficult challenge for beings like the Anunnaki and others, because even though humans tend to look at races as very linear, meaning they are either benevolent or malevolent, every race has within it a spectrum of beings with different intentions, and even within a certain dimension, levels of consciousness. Trying to group all of that together in one definition is truly not possible. So the Anunnaki as a race had certainly evolved to the ninth dimension, had experienced some genetic manipulation and changes taking place on their planet. And as such, many of them were seeking out resources and genetic information from other planets and other star systems. And this may have been at first a very benevolent intent, meaning they were coming in order to support their own race, but not to necessarily do damage to the one that they had now become a part of. Yet, what you must consider as we go back to our original story is that many of these very early Anunnaki portals had been corrupted and were research based, but not fully concocted in terms of their ability to allow a soul to come through in its purest and most, we'll say, purest and highest vibration, in other words. So there were many different skewed vibrations, genetic templates, intentions. Beings were lowered in consciousness. They had to reassume all that they had experienced before on a new planet in a new dimension. And this caused a great deal of confusion, as it would for many of you today, if the same thing had happened.
Okay. I want to clarify a few historical details so that we can set the proper context for some of the questions in the future, in this show and future shows. Now, it was said in some of these ancient texts and in the writings of Zechariah Sitchin that Anu was the king or leader of Nibiru, and that he was the father of Enlil and Enki. Is that true?
This is true.
Okay. And in many texts, including the Bible, the term heaven is used, and people in religious context believe that heaven is someplace you go after you die from a physical life. But in many of these ancient texts, it seems to sort of loosely suggest that heaven might actually be Nibiru, or some off-planet world that that people are taken to by the Anunnaki. Is there any truth to that?
There is some truth to what you are saying, but we want to make a very clear distinction between heaven being on Nibiru and heaven itself, because even this word is defined so loosely throughout time and space in many different religious teachings. To us, the true heaven is the present moment awareness that you are in connection with the one and a creator to infinite possibility. It matters not where you exist within the universe, that heaven is available to you in any moment. Yet, many souls were tricked from even the beginning of time by what we have called fallen angels, for example, who tried to lure them with the illusion that another planet would bring them enlightenment, and all of the prosperity and wisdom that they desired. And many did take their pilgrimage to this planet, but we wouldn't say it was necessarily the heaven that they believed that they were told it was. In other words, it's not that Nibiru is or always was a negatively focused planet, nor would we consider it a hell. It was, of course, very different than Earth, and human beings are meant to be on planet Earth because their soul chose that incarnation. To visit for a period of time another planet in the astral is something that you are all wired to do throughout your incarnation here. But to actually make a transition like this, even prior to the time in which your soul is meant to reincarnate, is not something that a soul is ever expected to do.
Okay, let me just sort of restate what you just said so I can make sure I understand. So you're saying that heaven, as you would describe it, is more of a state of being that we can reach while walking in this physical life. It's not necessarily a place we have to wait to go to when we pass on from this life. So far, am I on the right track?
That is correct. And we want to elaborate on this because in many of our transmissions, we will refer to heaven as a place in which a soul transcends to. And this is also true because as a soul is leaving its physical body, it's actually manifesting into more light and emerged state where it is free of any confines or perceived, we'll say, karmic themes that hold it in any state of suffering. But just because that experience exists or that opportunity exists does not mean that it cannot be achieved in another state or form. So in many ancient civilizations, the teachings around heaven were not geared towards the transition of the physical soul from a body. More so, it was apt to be taught as an experience that could be cultivated first within the self and then expanded into the field around it.
Okay. But, okay, so with that idea aside, in the ancient texts and the texts that are or various writings about the Annunaki, Enlil, Enki, and so on, when they're using the word heaven, I assume they're not referring to the heaven you just described, but rather were they describing Nibiru? Or when people were being said to be taken back to heaven by the Anunnaki, was that Nibiru or was that someplace else?
Yes, correct. That was certainly Nibiru.
Okay. So a couple more things I want to make sure I get correct. In these ancient texts, they refer to Marduk as being the firstborn son of Enki. Is that true?
It is true.
Another detail I want to make sure I've got correct is Enlil was said to be the firstborn of Anu, who was the king of Nibiru, and Enlil was supposedly given reign or control over Earth by Anu. Is that correct?
Well, this is a part of this story that gets a bit complicated. And what we always advise is that you keep in mind what has been told before is more of an analogy, not exactly a linear truth, because in periods where these biblical accounts were captured, the beings present at the time were attempting to relay a very profound quantum and vibrational message, far greater in its potency than just a historic account or a capture. So let's go back and talk about Nibiru again and give a bit more detail about what was happening at the time, because as you know, there were many nuclear wars taking place throughout the galaxy. This is why, still today, the nuclear wars and debates and energy that you're dealing with on planet Earth are a part of your current reality, because they are stories that started long ago in galactic history. But the thing to always remember about these nuclear wars is that they were focused not solely on physical destruction, so much as they were advanced, non-detectable frequencies aimed at eradicating genetics. So those on the planet at the time that were dealing with these very malevolent frequencies were trying to counteract them, both by ascending into other dimensions, using very even we'll say archaic portals to transfer their energy and physical forms into other dimensions, or doing genetic experiments, for example, in order to maintain their family lineage, because this was a very important thing to not only the Anunnaki, but many others, many other cosmic families, we'll say. So what you're seeing in this story, perhaps I could say, is an attempt to ensure that the Anunnaki genetic lineage live on, both on its own home planet that was under attack, as well as spread to different locations throughout the universe.
Okay, I don't quite follow though. What does that have to do with Enlil being king or a ruler of the earth? Why was that necessary as part of spreading their genetics to another planet?
Well, we don't necessarily see that being the case. In other words, we don't think he was sent to Earth in order to be king necessarily. But what you have to consider is that the Anunnaki believed their genetics to be superior. So, for a soul to come to Earth with superior genetics, they would be considered an enlightened teacher or council member, someone who was mentoring and leading those that did not have the same capability. So, certainly, with the entry of that being to Earth, there would have been an assumption that there would have been some hierarchical state that they would be existing in.
Okay, and on a side note, I just want to, because it occurred to me while you're saying that, is that original agenda or idea that the Anunnaki have superior genetics carried forward to modern times in, for example, the eugenics program that still exists today, where world elites are trying to purify the race because they believe their genetics to be superior?
Yes, this history continues to play out on your planet in many, many different forms.
Okay, going back to Enlil and Enki then. So we established before that Enlil was more malevolent than Enki, and Enki, you said, was able to consider the bigger picture or something along those lines, essentially meaning that because he was more benevolent, he more similarly to the Atlanteans could consider the impact of his actions and their actions on the whole of the planet and other beings, whereas Enlil was not able to do that because of a greater level of density. Is that correct?
It is correct.
Okay. And this is what would make one benevolent and the other malevolent.
Well, we might even say that Enki was freed of his density and any egoic perception as Enlil took on the bulk of that dense egoic energy. We had mentioned previously that they are somewhat equal parts of the same vibration manifesting in two different forms. So if you keep this in the back of your mind, you will see how the story continues to play out.
Right. So they were one being before they incarnated on Earth, and as they came through the portal, they split into two, and one ended up having more of the benevolent aspects and maybe more of an intellectual focus, scientific focus, where the other one was more of a malevolent aspect of the whole and was more militaristic and self-centered.
Correct.
Right.
Yes.
And would we even say, although we can't use the term satanic in that sense because that might have been prior to that term existing, but he might have been the origins of that kind of energy.
Certainly, we could use that terminology, and the way that we have referenced it in the past is that this is not one being, but a great many malevolent gods that were focused upon in order to manifest or to achieve something that a soul was focused upon. These rites and rituals have been practiced even off planet, but were brought to your planet certainly by beings such as this.
In some ancient times and also our ancient writings, but and also in ancient civilizations such as the Babylonians and the Sumerians and so on, they also attributed Enlil to the planet Saturn or Kronos, for example, and Saturn being referred to as the black sun, and essentially being, and also Saturn representing Saturday or the Sabbath, and also, which is Saturn Day, and essentially more of a benevolent, I'm sorry, malevolent, satanic influence. Is that all correct?
It is all correct. These are all applications of how these what you have called satanic areas of focus are shown to play out in the orchestration of the universe. It's not to say that the universe itself is malevolent, but everything that has ever been created there must be accounted for and also in some semblance of representation. So if malevolent beings have been praying to malevolent gods and achieving some type of malevolent focus, that is going to be captured within the spiral of time and be a part of every other soul's unique expression of what it is actually here to serve, because there is contrast throughout the universe. And when we're speaking of malevolent and benevolent beings, there are often thoughts that these two areas are to the extreme. Meaning, we have someone who's very enlightened who can only do good, and we have someone who is focused only on harm or trauma. And that has been the case here on planet Earth for a great many years and throughout even ancient civilizations. But by design is not necessarily the way of the universe. There is contrast throughout the universe, but that contrast has been manipulated in a sense. It has been captured and taken hold of and placed in a lower vibration through which that spectrum has now become so wide as you view it today.
I've noticed that even in modern times, in modern films, Hollywood films and so on, they tend to use Kronos and Saturn as planets where a lot of evil or malevolent gods originate from, and so on. So it seems like this Enlil story is continued. Is that intentional, or are they just unconsciously doing that?
Well, you must always think of the energetic influence behind anything that is utilized in a format like media, for example. While certainly Saturn does exist, and its influence is often focused on some of the darkest and most traumatic karmic patterns that humans carry, it is something that when symbolically utilized, is going to have a very similar effect, meaning, regardless of your actual astrological organization, the birth date that you chose, and how the stars revolve and planets revolve around that date, you are interfacing with a collective that is meant to have a very similar orchestration where all of you are going through the same things simultaneously. But this is actually what is attempting to be hacked. So, if a great number of human souls are attentive to or captured by a story through which certain symbology is utilized, they are going to end up energetically somehow imprinted by that influence and take it out into the world, and it must be integrated within their lives. You are energetic beings at your core, and those who understand how the universe works are using that to their advantage. And you can see why humans have been swayed so much from their metaphysical process or aspect of self. Because if you're only focused in physical, it is very easy for those who know the workings of energy to implant, we'll even say, to plant seeds of information within you that can cause you a great deal of suffering and pain.
Okay, getting back to Enlil, Enki, and the Anunnaki, when they came here, they came here to mine for gold. Is that correct?
They did come to mine for gold. It was not their only area of focus, but this was certainly one of the most important.
Is it fair to say that I know that the Atlanteans, who coexisted but in a ninth dimension at the time, now the Atlanteans being in the ninth dimension and low density, they considered the impacts of everything that they were doing and their experiments on everything, including the elements that they were working with. Whereas the Anunnaki came to Earth to mine for gold, which seems to me that they were doing this without consideration of the impact to the elements and the greater whole of the planet. Is that a factor of them being fifth dimensional and a higher density? And also, we'll get into this story in a minute, but supposedly they also experimented to genetically modify beings with their own genes. So were these all factors of being a lower dimensional being, lower consciousness than the Atlanteans?
It certainly was, but also anytime a cataclysmic event happens anywhere in the universe, you are going to find beings who are desperate to restore their genetic lineage or the precious elements of the planet in which they have arrived from. And this can cause even the highest dimensional being to choose things that are not in the best interest of others. Consider going through a cataclysm yourself. This would be a very dense and heavy experience. And because of that, you may be driven to do things out of survival that a more highly conscious version of you would not have done. And this is how we see this story playing out among many others.
Is that not happening at the present moment in our linear time as well? A
Certainly,
cataclysm.
a cataclysm to that degree, not necessarily the same event, but you are experiencing most definitely genetic war on a mass scale. And this has been the constant theme since the very beginning of time, because even when the earth first came into being and the original seeders came to work with the planet and to understand her wishes, there were cataclysms taking place in the galactic universe. So there were some who arrived on planet Earth not with a love-based intent so much as a more egoic and selfish one, because human beings, and we have discussed this before in past transmissions, carry the genetic template of every other galactic race throughout history. It's such a bright, beautiful, rich, and expansive library, we'll say, of information and codes and healing possibilities. It is the reason you have been limited in its access, but also the reason that those who go through cataclysms might come to Earth, because they are here to attempt to take what has been stolen from them from you, whether it is precious resource that can help influence their technologies to heal them genetically, or whether it is the actual energy that they siphon from humans in order to restore what has been disintegrated within them. Unfortunately, this has been the case for, yes, a great deal of time.
All right. So in the case of Enlil and Enki, what you just mentioned, we can't just say benevolence and malevolence are very linear black and white terms, because there could be many nuances between them. So even though in a broader sense we could say Enki was more benevolent than Enlil, because they were both in a fifth dimension and at that time on the planet, they, regardless, even Enki being more benevolent, was not able to consider the needs maybe of the whole planet or other beings on the planet to the same degree as, say, a ninth dimensional being with less density might do, like the Atlanteans. Is that a fair assessment?
It's certainly a fair assessment. We think it's a generality. It can be applied to this story, but yes, if we were to go into more detail, it might take away from the themes that you're operating within.
Okay. So if that's the case, then that would explain why Enki, who might have been more benevolent, still was in charge of doing experiments on the genetics of different beings on the planet at the time without, I imagine, without considering the larger repercussions of on those beings.
Correct. Yes.
And were they doing this to create a slave race to help mine for gold, as it says in the story, or is it something else?
We think this was a side effect of what was actually happening. So let's first back up and give some clarification about the purpose of gold and why it was so important to the Anunnaki that existed on Nibiru. The gold on planet Earth had taken on a very different quality than any other planet. And of course, any element that is brought to a planet from another one is going to hybridize into something completely different than it was before. All of you are doing that, even as individual souls. But when Nibiru found itself in a dire situation, many of its genetic technologies were unable to support, or we'll even say counteract, what was happening at the time. Consider that Nibiru and even the Anunnaki, they are very intellectual, scientific, and even research-focused beings in the universe. They're very interested not only in the technology, which is part of the human structure and every other structure and every other race that spans space and time, but they're also interested in creating technologies that can interface with them or even fuse with them in order to improve their resilience or to somehow program them to become something different than what they are. And this has been going on in Nibiru, or had been for a very long time, but these technologies were their first go-to in terms of protecting and restoring some of the damage that had been done to their DNA. But these were elemental technologies, similar to what you may have found in Atlantis, but of course, not exactly the same. This is why the gold was required. The Anunnaki found it to be the perfect elemental property, not only to within their bodies pull out and reconfigure, or we'll say transmute or neutralize the radioactive materials that were causing harm, but also to use in their technologies to support the continued healing. So, what you're seeing on planet Earth in terms of this historic timeline has a lot to do with both taking advantage of human DNA and the energy and information that existed within it, while also transforming a soul into perhaps a slave, as you have mentioned, or someone who has no other ability than to take orders from another. And of course, we know that you are seeing these themes playing out very similarly on your planet today.
All right, I don't want to get too deep into this particular area, but I do want to touch on it briefly because, and we're going to talk about this more in future shows. But we've discussed and even just mentioned earlier how human beings are a blend of all of the races in the universe. Uh, just to clarify, when we say in the universe, we're talking about our universe in this 13 dimensions, correct?
That is correct.
Okay, so are there other beings in other other universes beyond our 13 that are different from the ones in this 13?
Yes, there are. And we look at the multiverse as an intelligent organization of beings, energies, planets, stars, and information similar to itself. So if you're looking at a different universe, you are definitely going to see not only different forms of beings, but a different manifestation of what you call DNA or genetics, among many other things.
From our earlier discussion, the original seeding of the human race happened long before Enlil and Enki arrived on Earth, correct?
Correct.
Now, Enlil and Enki, or rather Enki in particular, supposedly found some sort of beings that appear to, according to the description, to be very primitive, who were living in the forests and the woods at that time. And they were used in an experiment to combine with Anunnaki genetics to produce a more intelligent race that would take orders to mine for gold. Is this correct?
It is correct. Yes.
Okay, if the human race is originally seeded as a blend of all of these very advanced races, how is it that they were a primitive race of beings in the forest at the time that Enlil and Enki arrived?
Well, this is a very complex story, and we would have to take you back to the very beginning of time and events that happened during that seeding, which have more to do with a reptilian collective than the actual Anunnaki, because very similar to the story that we have been telling and played out in Nibiru, their star system had gone through a very dire situation and cataclysm. And because of this, reptilians came in mass to planet Earth while the seeding process was taking place. Now, there were certain alignments to Earth during this period of time, having to do with the sun and the great central sun. For example, these were gates and portals that were open because the original seeders were not necessarily physically creating human beings exclusively. They were using forms of immaculate and immediate conception, tantric practice, for example, and harnessing the power of every home planet and star system in order to do this. But with the arrival of a reptilian race and a similar focus on the richness and potency of their own DNA within your human bodies, many timelines began to fragment off. And some of those were diminished in human consciousness. In other words, the purest evolutionary path that the original human hybrids could have taken was derailed in some circumstances. So to find tribes or pockets of quote unquote humans who seem more primitive would be a reflection of all of the chaos that happens at the very beginning of time. So you have to consider that regardless of the beings who are here and what their intentions are, there can be a subtle and very slight change in frequency on any planet within any mass orchestrated event like this, and things can begin to go haywire. So you're always going to find on your planet right now examples of how this happened before, but also examples of what it could be. In other words, the very simple notion that you're all unique manifestations of consciousness, expressing in so many different physical forms and different races, is showing you the positive timeline that humans, some of you, have actually accepted. We could go on.
All right, I don't want to get too far into the original seeding. We'll come back to that in more depth in a future show. But what I want to establish for our conversation today is whether this group of human beings that the Anunnaki genetically modified were actually a primitive race to begin with.
Well, you have to define the word primitive, in other words. There are some human beings through free will choice that chose to evolve in a specific direction, which could have been at the time considered primitive in nature, but nonetheless was their path of enlightenment. So we don't necessarily see a primitive race as being something negative or having to be defined in any one way. So if you are looking at this situation and attempting to define the word primitive for us, it would be more helpful to confirm what you are assuming.
Well, when I use the word primitive, I'm using it in the context of the story of Enlil and Enki, meaning they felt that the beings that they were genetically modifying were not intelligent enough to take orders and to mine for gold and to be a slave race for them. So they found these primitive, what they called a primitive, or referred to in that context, beings and modified their genetics so that they could actually be intelligent enough to carry out orders and be a slave race, but not so intelligent that they would want to rule over the Anunnaki.
We actually believe the opposite to be true, meaning, in order for any race to come in and modify the human genome, they would be taking it into a lower expression because you are the only ones who take ownership and authority over your own genetic expression. If another influences that in any way, shape, or form, even if it is believed to be a positive intention, it is going to derail your divine plan. So it doesn't necessarily to us seem logical that the Anunnaki would assume that a group of human beings would need to become smarter in order to be enslaved and to do their work. They would have had to be lowered in their frequency and taken out of some semblance of access to free will or to the belief that they are connected to a source field in order to do the bidding of another.
So were these original beings that they discovered on Earth, who they considered to be primitive, of a higher consciousness, fifth dimensional or beyond?
Certainly, we would say fifth dimensional.
And were they operating with less density than the Anunnaki at the time?
Yes.
So they were in many ways more enlightened, we might say, in a generalized sense.
Yes, we agree with that
So when the
statement.
Anunnaki are using the terminology of being primitive, they're not really referring to consciousness, they're referring to the ability of these beings who were actually more conscious or more enlightened than the Anunnaki to be able to follow their orders and mine for gold, which may be a more enlightened race of beings as they were prior to the modification, would not have wanted to do that because it would have been a very trivial use of their life.
Correct. We think this is a convenient judgment call that the Anunnaki are making about a race that was never meant to be what they wanted it to manifest as. And in order to accomplish their goals, had to actually lower the frequency of their genetic template.
In any way, has the vaccine of the last few years done that to the human race as what they did in ancient times, or is the vaccine a totally different thing?
What you must consider is that this is the same story playing out with different characters and physical conditions. And that is ultimately how the spiral of time works. Any story that has not changed, or any, we'll say, vibrational pattern that has not been interrupted, is going to continue to come back and have to be a part of the experience of the race that its history exists within. So you're experiencing right now the coming back of this same timeline that you are perceiving through modern times, with the addition of different characters, different themes, a vaccine, for example, versus the use of some other form of technology, but it is the exact same intention.
In that context, then, is it fair to say that human beings of a few years ago were of a higher consciousness on the whole than they are today because the vaccine has lowered their vibration and their consciousness, maybe even made them more of a slave race?
Well, we have to keep in mind that numbers don't always apply in the equations of the universe. So, if you are looking at the number of people who have been genetically manipulated and lowered in consciousness versus those that haven't, it may seem very defeating. But what you have to consider is, in order to have a higher bandwidth of consciousness, you must also be vibrating faster. And that vibration is always going to counteract one that is lower, meaning that higher vibration of the higher vibration of one individual, for example, could neutralize or cancel out the lower vibration of 10 human beings of their likeness. So, to look at it from a couple of different angles, we would say that there is a force that is pushing against the rise of consciousness, using some of the same implements, intentions, and technologies as what have been used in the past, intending to hamper the evolutionary path of humanity or your race. Well, there are some who have awakened out of the timeline repeat because they have made different choices. It is this simple. The choices that are made are always the key to knowing whether or not a soul will continue on the same path or move its timeline into a higher dimension. And many of you are making different choices. So even if the numbers don't align in the way your minds believe are important for consciousness to be raising, we still see that a certain threshold of consciousness has been achieved. It is simply like a tug of war right now between timelines, where some of you have ascended into a higher one, and others are still replaying the same decisions on a lower one.
Okay, I want to sort of encapsulate and generalize what you said to make sure I'm understanding correctly. So what you're saying is that even though in the last few years, because of the vaccine and other frequency modification technologies that are being used, we might say more numbers of the human race on the planet as a whole may have descended lower in vibration. But at the same time, there has been enough of an increase in vibration of a smaller number of people that it sort of, on the whole, would say that the collective consciousness has actually advanced further toward a higher consciousness, even though the numbers are greater in the lower consciousness, just because the higher consciousness kind of is sort of overrides that to some degree.
This is correct. And there's so many other reasons to consider. One that is important of note that we will share has to do with the vibration and the consciousness of the planet that you are on, which many would never consider a part of this equation, because it is seemingly easier to believe that you are the ones influencing the planet as opposed to the planet influencing you, but it does go both ways. And there have been so many erratic changes that have taken place within the inner Earth, within Gaia's meridians and grid system, as well as a solid reconnection to the universal grids. And that is causing the anomaly of collective energy to begin to surge, meaning humans are becoming more connected in a unified field, regardless of whether or not they're seeing evidence of that in the physical plane. In fact, we think that unified field is the reason why so much of what has been hidden from you is now coming to the surface. It is like a bubble preparing to burst, and the level of transparency has become very crystal clear. So even those who may have received the vaccine technology and maybe lowered in vibration and consciousness are somewhat being pulled into a very strange anomaly of having to view both sides of this equation, where they have made choices that might go against things that they're now realizing.
Going back to the original, or rather the genetic modification of these beings in the Anunnaki timeline we're discussing, in biblical stories and other ancient stories, they refer to Adam and Eve having been created by God, and that they lived in a place called Eden. Now, in the Anunnaki stories, also there's a place that's referred to as Eden. Are these the same place?
It is the mimicking of the original story, in other words, because if you account for the fact that the Anunnaki were leading humans to Nibiru with the idea of living in heaven, you must also consider that the idea of Eden had been similarly fashioned.
So, are you saying that the story of Adam and Eve in Eden preceded the Anunnaki story, and they just sort of adopted it, or rather, maybe in ancient stories, recalling the event, they just adopted that storyline?
Yes, we agree.
Okay. But did a place called Eden actually exist on Earth in the Anunnaki timeline, or was that just a later storyline that was used to make sense of it?
Well, we look at Eden as perhaps an opportunistic manifestation that the Anunnaki were putting into place in order to not only have a peaceful environment for themselves, but lead others to become more like them. For example, if you look throughout history, many intergalactics who came and hybridized created their own communities and their own tribes. Sometimes these were housed within the pillars of temples, for example. Some Shambhala, for example, various locations that are now cornerstones for certain experiences and teachings. And this story that you are speaking of with the Anunnaki is quite similar, yet we don't necessarily see it being equal to or similar to that of the biblical account of the original Eden. By its very nature, it assumes to be a space of creation, a space where manifestation comes easily and all things are balanced. Yet, this was not truly the case for those Anunnaki who were present on the planet. It's not to say, and we always like to make this caveat, that every Anunnaki who came to Earth was malevolently focused. And we know that this goes along with the story that you are telling. We just want to make the point that some of them began creating somewhat like their own religion, trying to pull not only other Anunnaki, but human beings together in a pool of energy and information to sway their minds.
Now, there's some speculation that Mount Moriah and the Dome of the Rock were originally a spaceport that was used by the Enlil and Enki, that group of Anunnaki, and was later adopted as a spiritual center for the in Jerusalem. Is that correct?
This is one of many, and we want to be careful with our words here, because when you use the term spaceport, for example, we want to relate it to loosely to a portal, but also bring in the concept of a gate, because a stargate and a portal are two very different things. Portals tend to assume their own personality, their own consciousness. They hold intentions. They are part of a unified collective of every other portal throughout the universe, but sometimes they can become very unstable. Of course, as you know, technologies have been placed within them. There are many different considerations when we are looking at portals. Stargates are more of a clear passageway that don't necessarily hold residue and allow souls to transition from one form into another almost instantaneously. So stargates will move you between dimensions in a quantum fashion without having to hybridize or to change. In fact, stargates today are used to download information and codes, for example. And yes, we do see this as an important area that many ancient teachers would pass through in order to transcend the reality that they were in and meet others and have downloads, activations, conferences with others, for example. And these gates are also known for miracles.
So the Mount Moriah location was a stargate then.
Yes.
Well, so why would the Anunnaki use a portal to come to Earth in the first place if it's going to cause instability and splitting of their being into multiple incarnations, when they could have used a Stargate and come through without all those problems?
Because stargates operate very differently than portals. And we want to refer back to the transmission where we talked about dragons in the gates that they are protecting. These are somewhat like an elemental technology that are reviewing those that enter and scanning for intention. Remember, these are areas that maintain and hold purity, very similar to what we've explained in the construction of the 369 or a pyramid. In fact, we could say that many pyramids on planet Earth are constructed in the same fashion or idea of a stargate. They are meant to hold an unbroken connection with the universe. Yet, not every being is able to access them. In fact, many of you who tune into these transmissions may understand that there are certain times within the calendar year that gates are opened and gates are closed. And this is because the energies might be ripe for malevolence to become the focus versus times when enlightenment may be apt to happen. So we see these gates more functioning in unison with the intention of all universal beings as one, very much like the Council of Light. So if you are to consider that the council that you speak to often through this channel is reviewing what is being created in each planet and on each star system, and how that energy is exchanged and may affect another. A Stargate does this in a very quantum and automatic fashion. So to have a malevolent intent, or even to have gone through a cataclysm and be holding a great deal of density, would not allow a being to travel through a Stargate. We might even say that at this time in the history of the Anunnaki, certain gates would not have been open and available for their use.
There's another site that's also mentioned in a lot of these ancient texts, and that even is still around today, which is Baalbek in Lebanon. And that's also described as a spaceport that the Anunnaki, that particular group of Anunnaki use. Is that true, or what was that location used for?
Very similar, yet we don't exactly want to call this location a Stargate either. And for sake of not getting too confusing, we want to bring in a conversation about the inner Earth ley lines and meridians. As you know, very important structures like pyramids and temples were built upon these ley lines. And the reason for this is that the energy of Earth would allow a soul to catapult beyond it, and sometimes allow the entry like a portal to that area. So these are very mysterious, we'll say geographic regions where we notice there are fluctuations in the magnetic field, and those fluctuations almost always measure above and beyond what the human race is able to hold. So what that means is they are apt to be used by others as entryways, sometimes as healing centers, or places of prayer and meditation.
And so, in this particular case, in Baalbek, Lebanon, which is also called Heliopolis during later times, was that so? It's obviously you're saying it was on a ley line, which would make sense. Were they now? This was a used in later times after that, or maybe even later years. That group of Anunnaki beings for the worship of the god Baal. So, which hence the name Baalbek. Was that worship used on that ley line to further the intentions of that particular god or that worship?
To worship a god of this nature on a very highly magnetic ley line and geographic location is to send out the vibration as a message to be integrated by others. Also, there is an accumulation of power or energy in these grid sites where if the same prayer, we'll say, or intention is practiced, the souls who pray and practice will be able to return to this area and utilize it to their intention. In a sense, we believe the area actually becomes captured, which is a loose explanation of what we think happened in this sense, but nonetheless still happens today in so many regions and areas of your world where those who are very knowledgeable or adept at working with these extra sensitive areas can place whatever words, symbologies, intentions, or prayers into them and affect an entire collective.
Now, Baal and Baalbek, in particular, the word Baal has been a god that's been worshipped throughout ancient times and has been attributed to Enlil. Is that correct?
It is correct.
And also the word, the term, or the god Bel is also attributed to Enlil. Is that correct?
Yes, loosely, yes.
When you say loosely, what does that mean?
Well, in not every occasion, we would say.
Okay, so is Bel more of an umbrella term that's sort of a
That's a good
satanic term,
analogy.
maybe?
That
Okay.
is a good analogy to use, yes.
So we could say the ancients might have used Bel to represent generally a satanic sort of god, and Enlil happened to be sometimes attributed to that.
Yes, correct.
Okay, but Baal was always attributed to Enlil, or was that also a generalized
We
term?
see that more of a direct alignment in terms of the name. Yes.
Okay. And Bel and Baal were also associated with Kronos and Saturn, so there's that connection of Satanism and Saturn and so on, correct?
Yes.
Well, I've noticed an interesting thing in my research into ancient civilizations. I found many, many references to the worship of Baal or Bel or Enlil directly, even to the point that many of the ancient kings in the Sumerian and Babylon civilizations, for example, used the name of Baal or Bel or Enlil in their actual names, or even when they became kings, they assumed the name of Enlil in many many cases as a sort of signifying that Enlil was the one whose authority under which they rule. But I have not found any references at all to Enki or him being worshipped as a god in any of these civilizations. Yeah, it doesn't mean that they don't exist, but certainly there is a prevalence of worship of Enlil that existed in ancient times. Is there a reason for that?
Well, there are many reasons for that that we could get into, but we want to go back to the idea of slavery and the manipulation of genetics because um, Enlil became very known not only for his research, but his work in this area, which was highly successful in terms of being able to accomplish not only his goals, but change the dynamics of a race to actually follow his leadings. And many in hierarchical positions today are using the energy of that timeline and that being to inflict very similar types of scenarios. Some very knowingly, meaning they are openly aware that tuning into the energy of this malevolence is going to bring them more power, abundance, and ability to rule. And others have just been trained in this way because we have to consider that this is a lineage. Not just a blood lineage necessarily, but many on planet Earth have been trained in the rites of working with what you call satanic energies, which simply is a process of calling in a great many gods who at the time were seen to grant wishes. And this power, it accumulates. So everyone who's using it is adding to a pool of energy and information that others can tap into and encapsulate for themselves. And that's why this ritual continues on. It is, in fact, directed at lowering consciousness, but also ensuring that what is seen as a more primary race of beings on planet Earth continues to remain in power and to be able to not only tap into the wellspring of energy that they desire whenever they choose, but also to make the earth their own.
Well, we'll discuss this in more detail in later shows, but I want to just touch on what you're saying in that in my observation of studying ancient civilizations and even modern times, I've come to the conclusion that our entire global structure, at least in mainstream society, is based on the Anunnaki and in particular Enlil. Is that correct?
It is somewhat correct, but what we want you to remember is that you're only tuning into one timeline possibility. Because if everything that has ever been created continues to live on planet Earth or even beyond, that means that the opportunity to move into a different dimensional reality actually exists. So yes, we agree that the foundation of your entire society, especially the global consolidation of a government system, is based upon this history and this idea. But going forward, what we believe you will realize is that the very idea of breaking out of the matrix is real, because your ability to transcend this timeline has little to do with everyone following you and contributing to it. It has more to do with your free will choice and your ability to actually see it to begin with. Because so many, even those who are deemed ascendant and conscious, cannot fathom the idea that this level of history continues to repeat. But if you look all around you today, in every facet of society, you will see it right before your eyes.
Okay, I want to backtrack a little bit to an earlier conversation that we had today, and to touch on what you just said to make sure that I'm understanding correctly. But I don't want to get too far into the original seeding in this conversation. But you mentioned that in the original seeding, we're a combination of all of the races in the universe, in our universe of 13 dimensions. And because the reptilians interfered with that, the race that resulted in the time that Enlil and Enki came to Earth, that they described as primitive, were in the fifth dimension and might have degraded a bit from the original seeding. Now, but you did say that not all of the original seeding became degraded, that there were some that did not. So in the context of what you just were saying about how the future we can choose different potentials, were the Atlanteans another potential of the original seeding of humans that actually went to a higher dimensional consciousness, whereas these so-called primitive people that the Anunnaki encountered were maybe the ones that were more adversely affected by the reptilians?
Yes, and there are some reasons behind this. So it isn't free will choice only. It's a bit more complex than that, and we'll describe it as genetics versus epigenetics, which we know many of you are familiar with. There is a technology within you, your entire suite of 12-strand DNA, carbon and crystal, meant to function and operate as one. This will lead you to everything that you are meant to experience, and you have the possibility to infinity of improving upon that experience, the foundation of which is what happened before. But often, what we've seen, simply because of this seeding event, is that humans have been not necessarily lowered only in their consciousness, but operating through the close proximity and activation of their reptilian DNA. So if you have a race that remains on a planet that isn't necessarily meant to be here, they are going to influence through environment and close proximity, whether that be physical or energetic, everyone else's DNA, because you are meant to hybridize together. But a great deal of chaos has ensued here. So when you're looking at the primitives, for example, versus the Atlanteans, what we might say is those deemed primitive were far more influenced and dominant in their reptilian DNA, shutting down the rest of it, not actually being able to function in all 12 strands. And that makes a huge difference in terms of the dimension that you are able to access and also hold.
Okay, but were the Atlanteans another offshoot of the original seeding of the human race that actually went to a higher dimension, whereas these so-called primitives went to a lower one because they were more manipulated by the reptilians?
Yes, we can say that is an accurate statement.
Okay. So in a similar fashion, we have the same choice available today. We can go in these two directions.
Correct.
So just to evaluate a few details to make sure they're correct, the the term or the god Beelzebub is also considered the same as Bel or Baal or Enlil. Is that correct?
Yes, it
Okay.
is.
And so, is it fair to say that the various Semitic um, races or religions were, because we talked about the Dome of the Rock and Mount Moriah and so on, which is in Jerusalem, and they're very popular religious sites for the Jewish faith. Was the Jewish faith and other Semitic groups part of a genetic of this Anunnaki group we're discussing?
There is a very strong influence and genetic bloodline that runs prominently through those that are a part of this religion, but it is not exclusive to everyone, nor every facet of that religion.
Is there any concentration of this genetic bloodline to this group of Anunnaki in the Ashkenazi Jews versus regular Jews?
Certainly, we do see a more heavier influence in this area of Anunnaki bloodline.
I've heard some information recently about how the vaccine over the last few years, one of the genetic groups that it does not affect as much are Ashkenazi Jews. Is that correct, or is that just a made up story?
It isn't necessarily made up, yet the way it's being talked about isn't 100% correct. So keep in mind that any type of genetic technology or modification is going to have its limitations. And certainly there is malevolent intent here, and any malevolent intent has to be accounted for. But if we have a genetic lineage or a race from the beginning of time that has been focused on preservation and has been tapping into this energetic pool, we'll call it, of magic, what we'll see is their influence in a non physical way in terms of manifestation is going to have a significant impact. Sometimes what we want to do is connect the dots and in a linear fashion make people responsible and in a very conscious and physical way. Yet what we're saying here is this is more an energetic manifestation than a physical one. What's happening is history is accounting still for the dominance of this timeline that has happened since the inception. And that means whatever is manifested in its likeness is going to have a similar type of effect. There are some who are going to be spared and others who are going to be enslaved.
In recent years, I'm finding a lot of things happening in the world have very interesting ancient storylines embedded within them, which makes me wonder why, which illustrates really the fact that our world leaders are actually worshiping ancient gods and goddesses. For example, they use the term or the goddess Isis to describe a militaristic group of people, and for example, in recent years, the this group called ISIS was said to have destroyed the Arch of Palmyra, which is an arch that was on the Temple of Bel, which we talked about earlier. Bel being Enlil, or a manifestation of this satanic influence of which Enlil was part of. Um, is there any reason why ISIS was used as a term, or am I just connecting dots that don't connect?
First, let's back up to say that those who are in power have a very similar bloodline to the one that we have been speaking of throughout this transmission, meaning there is always some Anunnaki influence going on that perpetuates from leader to leader. And these are often human beings who are trained at a very early age in certain rites and rituals. So, to continue those on once they are older and in power is second nature. And this has gone on for a very long period of time. But when you are looking at the use of a name of a goddess, like Isis, for example, you are seeing the power dynamic in action, where it is attempted to degrade the name of someone who may not have been at the time of their incarnation in alignment with many of the activities that these families are carrying out. It doesn't necessarily show or mean in terms of an energetic manifestation any degradation at all. In other words, we're not concerned necessarily, but you have to notice the patterns, in other words, and that's what we think you are doing. So in connecting the dots and noticing the patterns, this certainly plays a significant role historically in where you stand today and where you are headed in the future.
All right, let me make sure I understand. So, are you saying that these world leaders are orchestrating events to play out ancient storylines? For example, using Isis as the image of a group of people who destroy the Temple of Bel, which is a satanic influence, which would essentially, if I look at it that perspective, it might say that Isis was benevolent and she was destroying a satanic influence. Am I understanding correctly?
Correct.
Okay. Now, in modern times, also, as has come out in recent years, there are a lot of uh, large international corporations and brands that are very closely connected with Bel or Baal, and you can even see it in their names. And even in ancient times in Babylon, Babylon, which was essentially also the worship of Enlil and Bel. And today we have Balenciaga, for example, that uses a lot of very questionable marketing with children and so on in their marketing materials, which also goes back to the same Enlil and Bel worship in ancient times. But what I'm getting to is in when the Arch of Palmyra was destroyed, there was a company that's called the Institute of Digital Archaeology, and or an organization, and they reconstructed the Temple of Bel, or rather the arch of the Temple of Bel, in many um, significant places around the world. For example, in London, New York City, Washington, D.C., and as an example, in many of those cases, the arch encompasses the Capitol building of those different locations. So in Washington, D.C., through the center of the arch, you can see the Capitol building. Uh, is this a takeover, in a manner of speaking, of the satanic influence from the time of Enlil of these world capitals and governments?
Well, what you're seeing is evidence of history manifesting itself in a more dominant frequency than what many of you would prefer. In other words, everything that's playing out on planet Earth today, it's both a vibrational as well as a physical manifestation. So we have to account for the idea that when history does repeat itself, which it must and it will, you are going to see the stories of the past manifest into modern day reality. And they are going to take these stories, different forms, different characters, different physical events. But the degree to which you are seeing this now is an indication of how many people are involved as well as influencing the rising up of that energy. So if we go back to the statement that we made about many hybrids and intergalactic beings understanding very well the workings of universal law. If you understand when powerful influences will come to the earth, for example, when you understand the relationship of the spiral of time to the present day reality, you can sway a great many humans who are co creating within it to strengthen the outcome that you desire. And that's what we believe has happened over the last several years is that the swaying of the human mind and human consciousness has contributed to the outcome of something that many of these old Anunnaki timelines were focused upon, and many today are still attempting to achieve. But at the same time, while we know it sounds very concerning, we want to also remind you that you're seeing things far more transparently and clearly now, as many of you have entered the fifth dimension than ever before. So even though the magnitude of what you are seeing seems greater than what you may have realized in the past, it was always present, in other words. So it's a good sign that many are speaking about these things, bringing them to light, helping to understand the relationships that you're putting together in these various transmissions, because it will assist every human being who is willing and able to shift out of their inherent connection to supporting the very things that they do not wish to experience.
So if these things have existed for a long time, since ancient times, then what's the significance of putting the Arch of Bell, for example, in Washington, D.C., overlooking the Capitol building? Does that show any change that has occurred in the lower vibrational, satanic, maybe influence of our government since the last few years when this was built?
Well, what it is showing is more consolidation. So we are always stressing that you are going for oneness, meaning that you are all creating in the highest intention of everyone else. But the opposite can also be true. As malevolent focus is attempting to consolidate, they're creating oneness in a completely different way and in a field of reality that many of you can become heavily encapsulated within. So we see this more as a sign of higher organization going on at these levels and more obvious output in terms of transparency and information, because in order for the rulers of the past to actually be able to rule at the level they did, they weren't hiding necessarily that they were working with some of the most malevolent gods in the universe. This was all exposed, and it did create a certain level of fear. And in today's reality, it is known that fear weakens the human vessel. So to, in an outright and outwardly fashion, put something that is fearful by nature is a very big power play in terms of what you're seeing with world government or consolidation of focusing this malevolent intent on the entire planet.
So what you're saying is that it's just becoming more out in the open and more transparent because the world leaders believe they have to be more out in the open with their what they've kept maybe hidden for a long time in order to have more control over the people. Basically, they need us to accept these ideas as normal.
Yes, exactly. That is a good way of putting it, because the more these things are out in the open and not seen as unique or detrimental, the more they are going to be able to implement things that humans don't actually want on their planet, but will accept as normal as well. In addition to this, we want to explain the arc a little bit, because in the galactic universe, arcs are very well known as energetic modulators, meaning as the energy is flowing through this curved type of shape, it is being intentionally directed, for example. So to frame out a very significant building with significant people using an arch was something that was done in many different dimensions and different intentions. Some very positive, because the rulers of the day were utilizing and channeling a love-based frequency and operating from that frequency, and others in opposition. So when you see these arcs, what you must know is there's somewhat of an energetic technology that is being created, where energy is being directed in some very specific fashion.
So in the original architecture of the Roman arch, which is used in many ancient buildings and even to this day, was that originated as worship of Enlil or Bel or Baal, or was it just a general technology that you're describing, or the concept of focusing that energy?
It was known that the shape itself would focus energy. So whatever was behind it could become expanded into the field around it. Now, this is not the only shape, geometry, even obelisks, for example, are very famous for tapping into the energy points and certain ley line crossings and using that as a tool of energetic manipulation, but arches a bit different in terms of their direction of that energy.
So with the Arch of Palmyra, which is in Washington, D.C., New York, and other major cities, the intention of the arch is more malevolent, and so that's what's being focused into the Capitol building and other major sites around the world.
Not necessarily. We believe that messages subliminally are being sent and directed from activities that go on in various buildings in these areas.
Transmitted through the arch.
Yes.
From where?
From the area in which it exists or beyond. So, for example, if the arch is framing a specific building and that building happens to be a place where government officials gather, and these government officials are focused on achieving a specific goal, that arch is placed there to help bring the manifestation of that goal to light.
Another thing that happened in the recent year is for the first time in the U.S. history, we had a different flag that was hanging at the White House. And typically that would represent throughout history that whenever you have a flag in a prominent position in a government building, that another force has overtaken that nation or that city or whatever the case may be. Is that what's taking place in the U.S. right now?
It is, but the flag and the timing of the flag is not the indication of when it took place. So this has been a long-standing focus and goal for those in government, and it is just being shared in a more obvious way, very much like the previous conversation.
I also noticed that this flag has an upside down pyramid at the top of it, which is very similar to a Masonic apron.
Yes.
Is this a Masonic movement that may be shrouded in other social movements now that people don't realize because they're attributing other social movements to this particular flag, whereas it's actually a group of elites or world leaders under a Masonic banner that are sort of taking over the United States government?
Well, this is the case in so many areas today that you are facing from a social standpoint. Because remember, the swaying of consciousness is what allows these beings to actually succeed in their endeavors, and that means they must infiltrate every area and create belief in certain things that weaken the human genetics. So what you are speaking about in terms of the Masonic symbols and involvement is true. Even dating back to ancient civilizations, there were many hidden Masonic rituals, for example, that are still carried out today in these elite circles that you speak of, because it is a way to gather power, to work with the mechanics of the universe. This is the foundation of all of the secrets that are revealed, and we must say that all of them are not necessarily in alignment with the truth of how the universe works. Nonetheless, they've gained so much steam and so much power through the years that on a physical plane of reality, they have become extremely successful. So yes, we agree with you that the symbol is representing what you speak of, and these practices go on behind closed doors more than you know, and are a part of the organization of so many of your societal structures today and belief systems that are not leading you down the best evolutionary path.
Now, does Freemasonry and its predecessors, such as the Knights Templar and others, do these originate with these Semitic groups that were connected to the Anunnaki we discussed earlier? Is that where the origins of Freemasonry come from, or is it in Egypt somewhere?
Not necessarily in the Anunnaki lineage so much, but we see factions of various ancient civilizations like Egypt, as you've spoken of, breaking off and exploring these traditions. And not every Masonic group was given the access to the secret knowledge that is the most, we'll say, powerful in terms of universal law. And you will still see today those who are practicing who aren't necessarily malevolent nor intending to be, but are on the surface level just given what they need in order to be a part of something that is truly siphoning energy from many on the planet. So in terms of origins, we can't necessarily locate any one specific timeline or experience, but many that culminated together as one.
So what you're saying essentially is that the vast majority of Freemasons are at low degrees and just ordinary people living their lives. It's really the people at the higher level degrees that are privy to this control system that they're orchestrating.
Yes, correct.
Okay. So what should we um, conclude by the reality that we're seeing the Arch of Palmyra at Washington, D.C., and we're also seeing this Masonic flag? What should we conclude as an overall idea of what's taking place in the United States as one example, because it's happening all over the world? Um, the state of the country, for example.
Well, you are seeing the uprising of darkness in the most tangible of forms. So, from our vantage point, humanity has just been given the greatest advantage because the more that you are able to see what has been hidden from you, the more information you have to create your reality to what you desire. It's somewhat like coming out of the dense fog of not knowing what many of these groups have been orchestrating right underneath your nose, and now seeing it so clearly that consciousness can no longer sustain it in the way that it has become. Yet we know from the ground level there are many physical considerations that human souls have to take. And this, as we have mentioned, is a consolidation of power. It is a group of beings all with the same lineage and focus, attempting to sustain the purest of genetics and to lead humanity astray off of its original divine plan, to keep it focused only in the slightest of genetic possibility, while others are able to ascend beyond. And this is not something that we take lightly. What we notice about this physical organization is it has its roots and its foothold in many of the ancient societies that we have been speaking of throughout this transmission. And it is just that the children of these ancient civilizations and secret societies have taken the bar and are carrying it now into the future. And they are doing so with urgency. So this is a period of time where you're seeing many historic timelines collide, And the urgency of a small and slight group of beings on the planet coming together to orchestrate control in a way that it has never been implemented before, even beyond the story of the Anunnaki and those that were genetically modified to mine for gold. This is complete and total technological control over your genetic template. That is the ultimate goal. And that's what we see humans awakening out of. It has always been the opportunity for those involved in these scenarios to awaken out of what those in power want to create them into and to become what they were always meant to be.
Do these world leaders know that they're worshiping, or are they intentionally worshiping Enlil, or are they just wanting to remain in power and therefore they use these ancient rituals to call upon these gods to fulfill their own agendas?
If you would have asked us this question a year or two ago, we might have said, no, it is not that every individual in power understands the connection. However, it has been prudent that they introduce this concept more deliberately to those who have been practicing for a very long time, not necessarily realizing who and what they were giving their power to. It is transparency in all directions, in other words, and this is why you've seen some of the change in power in certain geographic regions, because there are some who could not attune to the idea that they were actually praying to a more satanic or malevolent god, and because of this were set aside and replaced with others. And we think the push in order to do this more openly and deliberately is going to increase, especially over the next year. And again, it may seem fearful to those who are listening, yet we think it is a true advantage, because the more this is done out in the open and exposed, the more human souls at the truest and most compassionate of their soul's essence are going to shift directions.
So why the urgency right now to throw everything at the wall that they're doing and to go to such extremes such that it becomes obvious to all of us? As you said, this level of control has never been done before. So why now?
Determinations are always being made about future outcomes. So if we go back to many ancient timelines where malevolent rulers existed, they have always had a team around them of those who are able to access the astral, to tune in, no different than you are doing now, to receive wisdom and information, not only from guides and collectives of beings, but in a general sense about what the pulse of the whole of humanity was at in terms of belief, in terms of ascension, regarding genetic potential. All of these things are studied and then very carefully scripted in alignment with certain planets and stars, knowing that they are possible to amplify manifestations in the direction of those in power. But it has been seen as of late that there has been some great resistance within human souls on the whole. And this is not faring well for those in power, because it is causing them to rethink all of the strategies that they have had before. It is no longer possible, they believe, to do what they are doing undercover, because souls are now able to detect not only what is happening in physical that has been hidden from them in terms of truth, but also able to telepathically more channel information through their higher self, have intuitive and instinctual translations of energy. And the bottom line is much of what has been created by these individuals is failing at the physical level. Not because at the very beginning of this timeline, there wasn't a great deal of fear, and some human beings didn't choose the right path, but because there's now so much remorse and so much anger and so much seeing through the veil that new humans are literally emerging. And that is the greatest fear of those in power, because they know that the higher the dimension, the more access to genetic potential. The more that you are conscious, the more you are activating crystalline DNA. The higher you vibrate, the more you are able to reconfigure those patterns that you've been operating in for decades of time. So all of this is of great concern, in other words.
So is Enlil still incarnated somewhere and orchestrating these events through our world leaders, or are they just simply praying to him and bringing in that intention
Well,
forward?
there are some world leaders who believe they are part of the blood lineage, direct blood lineage of this being. And so they are keeping his likeness alive through themselves. But no, there is no incarnate being today that exists on planet Earth that is a representative necessarily. It is just the energy of that history and the focus of that vibration that is being channeled.
Well, then what are they praying to if they invoke the consciousness of this satanic ancient being who is no longer incarnated and no longer conscious to be able to communicate and interact with them? What is it that they're exactly worshiping? Which would similarly be the same question for any ancient god or spiritual teacher who people may worship today. What are you worshiping if that being no longer exists in a incarnate form?
Well, the concept is very much like channeling. So when a group of souls are focusing upon a being who is no longer incarnate, they are attempting to channel its energy, its wisdom, its courage, its propensity to think and to act and to feel, to actually become a part of it. And actually, this is where the bread and the wine, the practice of taking a part of Jesus within the self has become completely derailed. So if a satanic worship is actually a channeled event, the goal is to merge with that being and allow its energy to somehow imprint on you such that you become forever changed by it. And it is true that anytime an individual is praying to or channeling a being that exists beyond the veil, as long as a conscious connection is made, they will be forever changed by the interaction of that being. It is just the law and the nature of the universe. So this is put into deliberate action and focus. It is not just a praying activity where requests are made. It is a channeling of the energy, the history, the acts, the wisdom, the courage of that being in order to follow in its footsteps.
It seems to me that all modern mainstream religions, even though they may have originated with the teachings of benevolent beings such as Jesus, for example, were modified into more of an Anunnaki satanic religious format today. For example, the birth of Jesus is said to be December 25th, but actually December 25th is the ancient celebration of Saturnalia, which is a week of all kinds of debauchery that took place, and essentially the worship of a satanic being that was later turned into the worship of Jesus. So, is it fair to say that all mainstream religions today were actually colored by this Anunnaki lineage?
Well, it is the same concept. In other words, if a group of beings are gathering and is singing, chanting, praying, or meditating to a being or a god, to be able to capture and infiltrate that energy is of great use to those in power. And this has certainly happened throughout history. We cannot say that every single religion that exists on the planet today has been the focus of that corruption, but the ones that have been around for the longest time, that are the most prominent, we'll say, on the planet today, have unfortunately been influenced in this way.
So, why was Enki pretty much forgotten by our modern history, or has he been? Because I don't see any sort of connection with even ancient civilizations. It didn't seem like any of them worshipped him. I know we touched on this idea earlier in this conversation, but I want to conclude on this thought. Um, was it just simply because of what you said earlier that Enlil had an intention to have this control and worship take place, whereas Enki, perhaps of a higher consciousness or a less density, perhaps, and being more benevolent, a being, you wouldn't really have the egoic desire for such worship.
Well, that is the case. We want to share two different perspectives regarding this. It is important to note that the most benevolent of history has unfortunately been hidden from you. But it has not just been hidden so much as you have become the people who do not vibrationally match that part of the Akashic records. So nothing can truly be hidden from humanity, even if it is. You must become the people who vibrationally match that information in order to receive it. So on the whole, your collective has been operating in a very dense reality where the densest of history has become more accessible to you, and that has not has been somewhat lost or hidden. At the same time, yes, any being who is operating in a love-based frequency and truly lost of ego would not allow anyone to worship them beyond any other. It would not be in alignment with their integrity, nor would it fare well for what they were attempting to achieve in terms of their purpose and their soul's divine plan. And this was certainly the case.
So, using Jesus as an example, then the being or the human being, or whatever being that was Jesus in physical incarnation, what he taught in his incarnation is not consistent with what Christianity became today. Because Christianity, it seems like, is more of a satanic influence, whereas Jesus, the being, was not that and would not have wished to be worshipped. Is that correct?
This is true because in order to worship anyone, you are giving away your power. So, an ascended master of any kind would not allow a group of human beings to worship because it would diminish them to the point where they would not be able to recognize themselves as God or as the highest power, which is ultimately why you are all here and what you are rectifying in the karmic wheel of history. Yet also keep in mind that biblical translations have been taken out of context, and in ancient history, these were not written accounts that were extremely deliberate in terms of their stories. So not only have passages been completely left out or even destroyed, but those that still exist have been interpreted in a very hierarchical way in order to gather energy, to gather power, to siphon it from those who feel weak in the eyes of the Lord, which would never be the case for those who came to teach self-knowing and a relationship to prime creator, which exists within all of you.
In that context, you mentioned the word Lord, which even Lord seems to come from the Anunnaki as a word that was used to describe Enlil. So its use in the Bible seems to me to be a reference to, again, Enlil. Is that correct?
It is a limitation. It is a word that utilizes, we'll say, the lowest of vibrations in order to garner attention and energy.
Well, we're going to finish there for today. So thank you. And thank you, Micheila.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
And thank you all for joining us. We're going to end today since we've gone a couple of hours, and we'll continue this conversation next time. So if you'd like to join us on other platforms, you can see us ad-free on Rumble or listen on various podcast platforms such as Apple Podcasts or Google Podcasts or Spotify and a variety of others. So we'll see you next time for an Awaken Empowered podcast.